Today, we're diving into a really fascinating Supreme Court case. It's a story that came about because public officials were, well, wearing way too many hats. We're talking about power, public trust, and a huge constitutional fight that completely changed what it means to be in public service here in the Philippines. Okay, so let's start with just a number, 29. Kind of random, right? But in the context of our story, this number, it represents something so shocking. A concentration of power so extreme, it basically forced the country to rewrite its most important law. Yep, you heard that right. 29. That's how many government boards a single official, a man named Roberto Angpin, was a part of. And he wasn't the exception. That was the system. This is exactly what the 1987 Constitution was created to stop. So how on earth did we get to that point? Well, the whole story really kicks off with the scandal that set the stage for this court case. During the martial law era, it was just normal for top officials to be appointed to dozens and dozens of positions all across the government. And just look at these numbers. It's pretty staggering. You've got Roberto Angpin with 29 positions, Imelda Marcos had 23, Cesar Virata 22. The Supreme Court itself would later look back on this and call the practice odious and revolting. You can imagine why people were so angry. Right. So after all of that, the people who wrote the 1987 Constitution were absolutely determined to make sure this could never, ever happen again. And they didn't just tinker with the old rules. No, they created brand new, much stricter ones, aimed squarely at the country's top leaders. So to fix this, the Constitution laid out two totally different sets of rules. For most government officials, there's what we can call the general rule, which has some flexibility and allows for exceptions. But, and this is key, for the president, the vice president, and the cabinet, there's a strict rule. For them, holding any other office is basically forbidden, period. The message was loud and clear. If you're at the very top, you're playing by a whole different, much tougher rulebook. But, it didn't take long for this new rule to be challenged. President Corazon Aquino's administration came out with something called Executive Order 284. And this order, well, it seemed to go head-to-head with the brand new Constitution. What this EO did was try to take that more relaxed, general rule and apply it to the cabinet. It said they could hold up to 2 extra jobs in government and even get paid for them, which, of course, seems to completely contradict that strict, no-exceptions rule written just for them. And that set up the big question, the one that groups like the Civil Liberties Union took all the way to the Supreme Court. Could the president issue an order that creates loopholes the Constitution specifically tried to close for its highest officials? So the stage was set. This was a true constitutional showdown. Everyone was watching the Supreme Court, waiting for them to give the final verdict on what the new Constitution really demanded from its leaders. And the court's decision? It was decisive, clean. No ambiguity. They declared Executive Order 284 unconstitutional. The strict rule was there for a reason, and it was going to be enforced. But why? That's the important part. The court went back and looked at the notes from when the Constitution was being written, and the framers' intention was crystal clear. Just listen to what Commissioner Foz said. The president and cabinet have so much power that they need more checks and balances, not fewer. This wasn't some accident of wording. It was a core feature of the design. So what the court basically said was, look, you can't just take the easier rules for everybody else and use them to water down the specific, tough rules for the cabinet. They are 2 different rules for 2 different types of officials, and that higher standard for the top brass had to be upheld. Now, the court was also pragmatic. They knew that if the rule was 100% rigid, with zero flexibility, it could grind government to a halt. So they identified one very specific, very narrow exception to this rule. And this whole exception hinges on a Latin term ex officio. All it means is that you hold a position by virtue of your office. So you're not taking on a second job. It's more like an additional duty that's part of your main job. To make sure this exception couldn't be abused, the court laid out a really strict 3-part test. First, the extra duties have to be an essential part of the official's main job. Second, the law has to say they hold that spot ex officio. And third, and this is the real kicker, they absolutely cannot get any extra pay for it. Not a single centavo. You have to meet all 3. And the court gave us a perfect real-world example. The Secretary of Finance sits on the Monetary Board. Why? Not because they were appointed to a second job, but because they are the Secretary of Finance. It's part of their primary function, and they don't get a second salary for it. That's how it's supposed to work. It passes the test. So, after all that, what's the big takeaway? Why are we still talking about this decades-old case? Because it fundamentally changed our expectations for our highest public officials. This ruling really drilled home some crucial ideas. It says that being a cabinet secretary isn't just a full-time job. It's an all-consuming one that needs total focus. It's a massive guardrail against corruption and conflicts of interest. And by holding the president's team to the highest possible standard, it helps build back public trust in our government. At the end of the day, this case, Civil Liberties Union versus the Executive Secretary, it drew a bright, unmissable line in the sand. It made it clear that public service, especially at that top level, is a singular promise. It's a role that demands every ounce of your focus and total accountability to the people you serve. Which kind of leaves us with a big question for today, doesn't it? Decades have passed since this high standard was set. Do you think it's still working? Does this rule truly give us the focused, trustworthy leadership that the people who wrote the Constitution were hoping for? Something to think about.